and was able to sign, because he was the physician, was able to sign their death certificate and put old age. So, he had opportunity and he had control of many things that helped him get away with this for so long. On February 11th, 11 days after his conviction, Shipman was struck off of the medical register by the General Medical Council, at GMC over in the UK. And then 2 years later, Home Secretary David Blunkett confirmed the judge's whole life tariff, just months before British government ministers lost their power to set minimum terms for prisoners. Crazy. I do understand. I think blue collar, and I know I've said this as well. I think blue collar people who commit blue collar crimes, maybe not prison, maybe years of probation. I mean, we need to have people in prisons who are a danger to society. And I don't mean danger of stealing your money. That's bad enough. But, your typical blue collar crime, nobody dies. So, you can be an evil person and steal someone's money, or try to forge wills like, Shipman did, but you're not capable of killing anybody. So for me, that's fairly black and white. If we have prison overcrowding, then let go those people who are not violent offenders and fill the prisons with those violent offenders, and don't let them out for any reason. They're not going to be rehabilitated. We see over and over and over again where these people have been released even after a violent sexual assault, not even serving a full sentence, and then during the first 6 months or year that they're out, they kill 14 people. It's just, there's no logic to it. There's no logic to it. Why go through all that? Why go through all of that court, all of that expense, all of that trauma on the families when you're just going to let the man out later? It's just ridiculous. And I understand why victims' families, protest this and try to fight this so greatly. Now, while authorities could have brought many additional charges, they concluded that a fair hearing would be impossible in view of the enormous publicity surrounding the original trial. That's also true. I don't know that anybody, especially since we live in this information age, you're going to get someone in this modern world who hasn't heard of these murders. Let's say Brian Kohberger, one of our most recent. Few people have not heard about this. I don't know anybody who doesn't know something about Brian Kohberger. And that's because we're on the internet, we're reading stories, we watch the news, we get, little news briefs on our phone all day long. I mean, and even if you don't know the full story, even if you don't get the full details, like I do, because my motivation, of course, is to dissect their childhood and look for these mitigating factors. But if you're not doing that, and the name just passes over you, you'll remember, oh, I read something about Kohberger. Oh, that's the guy that, supposedly killed those 4 students. You'll know something. So it would be very, very difficult to have a trial and there not be some form of bias. And a prosecutor would have to really fight a defender, a public defender, or even a private attorney that was hired by them. Didn't matter. One of the first things as an attorney you're going to do is say, well, this case was highly publicized. There was no way that you could go within 200 miles of this place and not find someone who hadn't heard of the Kohberger case. And of course, if you've read one thing on Kohberger, you've read many, and a lot of them a lot of these articles have opinions in them. And whether you believe you do or not, if you read something, if you read 3 or 4 stories in a day or in a week that said there were people who doubted that Kohberger was guilty, that plants that in your mind. Maybe he isn't guilty. Maybe he didn't do it. So how would you go to trial and be non-biased? We just have an implicit bias by the way we are born and what we're born into. I talked with my students in class yesterday, and we were talking about how I was observing in a second grade classroom, and the ethnicity, the makeup of that classroom was every single child in that classroom was white. The teacher was white. The teacher I was observing was white. I was in there. I was white. So the diversity in this particular classroom, slim to none. I'm not saying that there's not some diversity across the entire school, or let's say even school system, but we just don't have around here a lot of diversity. But your bias towards someone of another race or another ethnicity is typically formed by your family and where they live. And when I asked my classroom the question, I said, do you see in that classroom where any bias could exist? Is there something going on in this classroom that would make you think, oh my goodness, maybe this teacher is biased, or maybe this school system is biased against someone? And the answer to that was simply that classroom was completely normal. Completely normal. As a matter of fact, none of the students said that they thought there would be any type of bias in that classroom. And I said the very fact that is a 100% Caucasian classroom with a Caucasian teacher and a Caucasian assistant or student teacher and me, and the fact that they didn't really see anything that was a problem is its own form of bias. Because if you were truly educated in diversity, non-biased, best practices, you might see that class, because it lacked, a lot of different ethnicities, that in and of itself would be recognition. Oh my goodness, we're just not that diverse. We don't have enough people, really. I mean, the majority of the entire school system is white. That really is the demographics of Scioto County. It is primarily a Caucasian area. And what we deem is normal, and they thought that classroom that I was talking about was completely normal, nothing out of the ordinary. That in and of itself is a bias, because we're going to expect every single classroom in this whole entire United States to look exactly like that one. That's what we think. Maybe it's subconscious that you think that. That's normal for you. But if I took you to an urban area where there was a ton of diversity and you walked into that classroom, it's going to be very different for you because you've been in classrooms that the ethnicity was the same as yours. But if you go into one that's primarily African American or a mix of African American students and Chinese students and Hispanic students and white students, and there's no main or like overarching ethnicity. In other words, not everybody's white. It's not a white establishment. People in administration represent all of the ethnicities in that school. I mean, there's someone or more that are Hispanic, and there are many others that are African American. There are many other people in administration and in teaching who look like those students in the class. So they're going to have a completely different idea of what a classroom looks like than you are here in Southern Ohio, or my students in Southern Ohio. And you might think about that wherever it is you live. What kind of diversity do you have? What would you think if you had this type of high profile case? Certainly, because it's a serial killer case, it's going to get a ton of coverage. How would you decide, if it was your ultimate decision, how to how would you identify enough people to come and be on that jury who hadn't heard about the story, didn't know enough about the story, or didn't have some form of bias? I think it would be much easier in an urban area when you're talking about a jury of your peers, because your peers are typically have a much better composition of ethnicity. But for us here, think about if we had a defendant, if we had a serial killer here in Southern Ohio, and it was an Hispanic male, and we wanted a jury of his peers, who would his peers be? Would his peers be the majority? Would the majority be white? Would they be Caucasian? Would the majority be Hispanic? Would there be a good mix of Hispanic and African American and Caucasian? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I feel like a jury should represent the population of the community. So if 25% of the population is Hispanic, 5% is Chinese, and 35% is African American, and the rest are white, who has the greatest number? That's what your jury should look like. Your jury should represent those, that diversity. If it's 25% Hispanic, then your jury should be 25% Hispanic. Does that make sense? I'm asking you a question that you cannot answer. Or if you can answer it, but I can't hear you. But that's what I'm saying. There's a very fine line between bias and non-bias. And so you may get different results from different juries. And that's why a lot of people, they take full advantage of appealing a court case, because then they'll get a whole nother set of jurors and they may have a completely different opinion about it. And that happens so often, so very often, unless there's just die-hard evidence against somebody. And that's not just serial killer cases. That's any kind of a case, any kind of a violent offender case, or, whatever. It still rings true. It's just really the matter of opinion of the jury and how they apply whatever statute or rule or law that the judge gives to them to consider. That's it. That's it. So also, for that reason, I don't think that people who get a life sentence or people that go on death row, I don't know that they should get an appeal, because maybe they should have their case reviewed by, professionals in the field to see if there were errors in the court. Certainly that we know that the defendant's attorney would be the one that was looking for these issues so that they could either call for a mistrial or get a new trial because their